Here and good to be back presenting once again this year, my fourth consecutive year presenting. I first did this in February 2020 on India and Pakistan. Oh, sorry, yes. First did it, that better. First did this about 3 years ago for India and Pakistan, and here we were talking about, again, the US and China. And I call this talk our Changing China Relationship, because it will look at how we treat China has changed and how they treat us has changed really over the last 4 decades. And especially in terms of the change since, the beginning of the Trump presidency and then continuing under the Biden administration, where Americans have kind of belatedly recognized that, the approaches they used in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, may no longer be as relevant as or as useful as they once were. So that is the important thing. And I begin here with this talk, the cover slide. This goes back to kind of the beginning of that period, of that, the pre-Trump approach to China. And this is February 1979. This is Deng Xiaoping, who is the leader of China. He became the leader of China in 1978 and would remain so into the early 1990s. And this is him in Texas, in Symington, Texas, at a rodeo, which no longer exists, in a small town near Houston. And he, after becoming president of China, wanted to improve relations with the United States, especially to help the Chinese economy. So his first trip abroad was to the US. And one of his stops was Houston. And before that, right before Houston, he was in Atlanta, where he signed a contract to allow Coca-Cola to be sent to China and sold there. Pepsi had already gotten the Russian Soviet concession, and so Coca-Cola was very eager to get into communist China. But he also visited a Ford plant, a relatively small car factory in Atlanta, but it's a small car factory, but it made more cars in 1 year than the entire nation of China had in 1978. So that shows how backward China was then. So Deng Xiaoping is trying to drum up American investment and stuff to help the Chinese economy grow. And he comes to Houston, first of all, to see NASA, to see the Johnson Space Center, again, to highlight the advantages of advanced technology, but also for oil drilling equipment. So he gets to Houston the day before this, and he's given a very chilly reception by the politicians. They are very anti-communist, both the Democrats and Republicans. They all refuse to meet with him. So they all give him the cold shoulder. They don't like that he's there. But the business leaders do. The Houston Chamber of Commerce is the one sponsoring his trip. And he is in Houston to get drilling equipment and refinery equipment and things like that, because China at this time is a net oil exporter. They don't have many cars. They don't use so much oil. They're exporting oil, and they want to do more of it. So they're basically saying to Hughes and all the other big oil drilling companies, we need your equipment. We need you to invest billions in our oil fields. And that's music to the Houston Chamber of Commerce ears. So this is, one of the, themes going forward in China, that, of who is interested in it. But generally, the people of Texas, they don't really like him. Deng, they're suspicious. He's a communist. He's seen as the enemy. And the next night, he goes to the rodeo in Symington. He goes to the rodeo, and a teenage girl who is one of the Bronco riders at the beginning of the show, rides up to him unannounced and gives him a 10-gallon hat, gives him a white cowboy hat. And he's a communist, but he is a good politician. He knows how to play to a crowd, even abroad. So he puts on the hat and he waves to everyone, and he gets hats for his entourage, and they all put them on too. And you see here, he's wearing what Mao Zedong wore, what was traditional Chinese political uniform. But he puts on this cowboy hat, and he wins over the people of Texas, and they do positive news stories about him. And so he charms people. He charms them. And Americans think well of Deng, until what happens in Tiananmen Square when he orders the massacre there in 1989. He is twice Times Man of the Year in 1979 and 1985. So he's popular in America. And he is a small man. He's about 5'1", 100 pounds, and he's wearing a very large hat. And he knows he looks ridiculous. He's in on the joke. But he's willing to play to the crowd because the nature of the relationship. He needs Americans to support him. And actually, this hat that you see him wearing, it's in a museum in the middle of Beijing. They have a museum, honoring their party, and they have a whole wing devoted to their great former leader Deng Xiaoping. And in the middle of the wing is the hat. Actually, a Texan a number of years back visited the museum and was horrified to discover that they had misused the hat. They had, smushed it, smushed it to make it flat, and smushed down the brim to make it look more like a Chinese hat. And so he ran panicked to the docent and was like, the hat, it's wrong. And they quickly fixed it, and that's the way it is today, and so forth. But this is the beginning of that new relationship, of that economic involvement, of China being friendly to us, of us being friendly to China, and China getting wealthier, China getting much wealthier, much more developed, allowing people to own land and buy property and start businesses, but with the Communist Party remaining in control. So Deng, he's devoted to the Communist Party, and his thought when he takes over is, we are really poor, and if we remain poor, we're not going to remain in power. So we got to make our people rich to keep power. So that is the whole point, that you make the people rich to keep the Communist Party in power and ensure that there isn't democracy and stuff. Americans over time will assume that as capitalism goes, democracy will follow. That's not what he's in for, and so forth. And that is, to an extent, that's how China's run ever since. You get rich, but you remain authoritarian, and the communists keep a monopoly on political power. That is, or as Deng calls it, socialism with Chinese characteristics. They're not fully socialist anymore, but they come up with various slogans to justify it and explain it. And slogans are very important to the Chinese communists, which is why I've grouped this talk based on various government slogans by their leaders. And they are important. They will change over time, often reversing themselves, but it's their marching orders. It's what the local communist officials follow. It's the theme guiding their actions, and it's how they propagandize the people. So they take these deadly seriously. They have all these slogans, and they run with them, and this is very important to how they market their party, so to speak. So the first is from Deng Xiaoping from 1989, describing China's strategy in the world. We will hide our strength and bide our time. That is his approach. And we'll look at what that meant, and that is music to Americans. And they interpret that, basically American leaders, that it lasts for so long, they think it's permanent. They think that is what China plans to do, but for Deng, it's a means to an end, as you can tell by reading between the lines. That bide our time. We're weak now. We're not going to make waves. Not going to cause problems. But when we're strong enough, then we're going to flex our muscles. But until then, we'll keep a low profile. And then similarly, as China gets stronger under a later leader, Hu Jintao, when he takes office, he adopts a slogan which is talked a lot about in America at the time, called the peaceful rise. This idea that China, people are noticing that China is stronger. They're starting to worry, and he wants to put the rest of the world, especially Americans, at ease, that our rise will be peaceful, we're not going to be threatening. But again, that's a means to an end. Then, as China gets stronger still and gets new leadership under Xi Jinping, their current leader who took over in 2013, he comes up with this phrase, striving for achievement, that China will get more involved internationally and do things on its own and start to make its own imprint on the world. That is his marching orders to the Chinese. And then as things start to change overseas, in terms of the democracies in America and other countries, he ups the ante and does this idea of great changes unseen in a century. And we'll look at what that meant and what that implied. That essentially he is saying there that we've bided our time, we've hit our strength, now's the moment to strike. Now's the moment to assert ourselves. And that is kind of, that is also when Trump takes office and when American rhetoric starts to change and our relationship becomes more combative. We had always been competitors, we had always been rivals. US and China always had their differences, but they were able to kind of hide that and be in denial about that and paper that over for the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And then eventually that became untenable for both sides, and we end up where we are today. And we'll look at these different eras as defined by their slogans. So the first one, hide our strength and bide our time. This reflected what Deng had been doing, since he came to Houston in 1979, as you saw by that picture, and charming the Americans. But he said this in reaction to what happened in Europe in that autumn. So this is November 9th, 1989. The East Germans stormed the Berlin Wall. They go over. This is the beginning of the end of communist Eastern Europe. 2 years later, the Soviet Union goes out of business. This is very shocking to China. Now, China had for a long time not gotten along with the Soviet Union. They were rivals in the communist world over who would lead. This is why Deng came to America. The official reason was kind of to be buddy-buddy with us to keep the Soviets at bay. But they were also communists, and if they can fall, and they were even more powerful than the Chinese, this could happen in China. I mean, there were hints of this in Tiananmen Square in June of '89. So, something like this had almost happened in China. The Chinese went in a very different direction than the East Germans. This didn't happen there. But that was, his idea is, how do we keep it? So the Chinese leaders become obsessed with how not to end up like the Russians and the East Germans, how to avoid their fate. It's still their obsession. It's still the first thing they think of every day. How do we not end up like the European communists? And they come up with, some answers. The first one is that the Soviets allowed free speech, they allowed people to read critical things of the government, and that weakened the government's power. And that's why they fell. So don't concede anything to the people, keep a monopoly on information, keep a monopoly on power. The moment you try to reform, that's the beginning of the end. So that was the first lesson. The second lesson was that the Soviets spent way too much on the military. They overspent on the military, pointlessly trying to keep up with the wealthier Americans, and that sacrificed their standard of living, took away money they could use to invest in technology and things, and killed them, and broke them down. And so China decides, they're not going to do that. They're going to hide their strength, bide their time, and they will increase military spending, but only as their economy increases in size. And it does, but as their economy increases, the military gets more money, it modernizes, it makes new weapons, but it does so very slowly. They're not going to rush things like the Soviets did, and they recognized that was a mistake by the Soviets and helped, lead to their downfalls. So they're going to take a different tact, and they are not going to antagonize the Americans. They're going to be nice to the Americans. They're going to be nice to their potential enemies and rivals as they build up their strength. They will trade with us. They will get investment from us and from Japan and even from Taiwan, which is the renegade province they want to conquer. They will get all this money to help their economy and so forth, and they will take part in the global system and strengthen themselves, and this will not happen to them. That is their idea in this period of time. And that will guide Deng Xiaoping. It had guided him already in the 80s, and it will guide his successors in the 90s. So another thing the Chinese did after Mao Zedong, the founder of their government, takes over in 1949, runs things, whatever he wants, he does, often goes very badly. He dies in 1976. Deng decides, we're also not going to make the mistakes Mao did. We will have rotation in leadership. So he establishes every 10 years you have a new set of leaders, a new supreme leader, a new set of junior leaders, and every generation gets its new leaders, and you have collective leadership, and this will prevent one man from doing a lot of stupid things and reckless things. That is, and we'll see how that has changed, but that is his thing. So he steps down before he dies. He steps down, and his successor is Jiang Zemin, who rules China in the 90s, and then he steps down after 10 years. And China is ruled by another man for 10 years, and then he steps down, and Xi Jinping takes over in 2012, and he's still in charge. His tenure's up, and we'll look at the effects and meaning of that. But generally, that was the idea of how China would keep an even keel, that they would have this new approach and so forth, kind of this sort of collective leadership. His successor is Jiang Zemin, as you see here with Bill Clinton. So Bill Clinton visits China in 1998. He is the first American president to visit China since the Tiananmen Square massacres, which kind of soured Americans on Deng Xiaoping and showed us, what the regime was capable of to keep in power, using tanks and soldiers against its own people if they rebelled and protested. But now China is making nice with the Americans again. And this had been the case, for a while. For instance, after Deng Xiaoping visited America, in 1984, Ronald Reagan went to China, and he was very impressed. Reagan, staunch anti-communist, had been very anti-Chinese communist for a very long time, had opposed Nixon reaching out to China in the 70s, but now that he's president, he goes to China, he gets charmed, and he actually tells the press that China is no longer communist, which would have been news to the Chinese. But he says he calls China so-called communist China. And the reasoning is probably that he saw Chinese people selling stuff and making money and owning land and owning businesses, and he's like, that's not communism. So he was thinking economically. And so, even Reagan was charmed by them. And so was Clinton. So Jiang Zemin the year before in 1997 had gone to America, and he had visited Clinton in Washington. And this is, when America is super powerful, there's no other powers that matter, and America basically thinks it has the answers to everything, and we are quite arrogant at that time, both militarily, economically, in every possible way. And we also think democracy is everyone's future. That is humanity's birthright. That, after communism fell, much of Eastern Europe became democratic. Russia, for a time, had competitive elections and things. So other parts of the world, South America, lots of Africa, lots of Asia, where there had been mostly dictators, they also in this period became democratic. So it was assumed this was inevitable, that capitalism and democracy went together and they'd follow, and the same would be true in China. And so that was the assumption at the period. That, curiously, had not been the assumption in the 80s or the 70s. So in the 70s and 80s, no one in America is talking about Chinese democracy. That is not talked about. And even in the 80s, you did have Chinese who risked their safety advocating for democracy, and you had people in the Communist Party calling for elections. So in the 80s, you did have some people in China, proposing these things. After Tiananmen Square in 1989, that goes away, but only in the 90s, after all hope of democracy dies within China, everyone else in the world assumes China will become democratic because of events elsewhere. And Clinton is not alone in this. Clinton is this idea that we open up China, we trade with them, they'll eventually become democratic whether their leaders want them to or not. And he's very open about this, even with the Chinese. And this will continue into the 2000s. And so Americans will move the goalposts, and they will assume the whole reason we reached out to China was to make them democratic, and this has been a failure. And that was not the reason. That's not what Nixon wanted, or Carter, or Reagan. That had not been the hope all along. The hope was to not have another Vietnam War or Korean War, and to help our businesses and their businesses work together. That had been the hope. But we changed the narrative in the 90s, and Clinton was a part of that. So 1997, Clinton and Jiang Zemin are standing next to each other at a news conference. And so naturally, an American reporter asks Jiang Zemin about Tiananmen Square and basically says, defend all the horrible things you did there. And so Jiang Zemin starts doing it and explaining his side of the story. And like a minute into him speaking, Clinton interrupts him. He interrupts the Chinese president and basically says, you're wrong, what you're doing is wrong. And he explicitly says to him, you are on the wrong side of history. And that's how Americans talk, you're on the wrong side of history, we win, our way of life will prevail over yours. And now if you did that to all hell would break loose. They would not tolerate that. But Jiang Zemin does. He does because he wants American investment. He wants to grow his country. China is a lot weaker than America, so he has to be humble, even though Clinton is completely disrespecting him like that. And he invites him the next year to go to China, and they're getting along, despite that. And not only that, he he lets Clinton give a speech to young people in China about democracy at Beijing University. Not only does he do that, he puts that speech on national television, on state-sponsored television, so Clinton can speak to the Chinese people, and that's, Clinton's whole goal. It has no effect, but, Americans had this hubris back then, and the Chinese are willing to humor that, because it's the price of doing business with America. And this ultimately pays off in 2000 when China joins the World Trade Organization. And that supercharges their trade, allows them to get around tariff barriers, and then their economy really, really takes off. Before this, they had done some exports. In the 80s, it was mostly for the domestic market, in terms of what they did in local manufacturing. But then in 2000, he gets Congress to approve China joining the World Trade Organization, and then they really take off. And the hope is that this will, open markets lead to open societies. But again, that only comes up in the 90s. That was not the original goal in America going back to the 70s and 80s. No one was talking about that then. So that is important to understand in terms of whether we judge American policy with China as a success or failure. And again, these hopes continue on into the 2000s. Of China becoming democratic, even though China is not liberalizing in any way, shape, or form, and the communists are completely in control and crushing all dissent. But it continues, and continues again under George W. Bush and Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao is Jiang Zemin's successor. Jiang steps down after 10 years. Hu is appointed. You have a new generation of leadership. And him and Bush, they genuinely get along, as is reflected in this picture. They like each other. Bush, when he comes into office, promises to get tough on China. That he will be more hawkish, more, confrontational with them. Then September 11th happens, and our priorities change. This is 2002. We invade Afghanistan, we then invade Iraq. We are distracted. And this works out very well for the Chinese, because we're not bothering them, they're not bothering us, they're left alone. Their trade with us and the rest of the world is ballooning. We are in no position to cause trouble for them. So in some ways, under George W. Bush, that's when you have the best American-Chinese relations, because there's no disagreements. Even during Clinton's time, there were tons of disagreements. There were all sorts of confrontations over various matters, which had to be smoothed over. And there had been the same in previous decades. There's none of that in the 2000s. We're too busy doing our own thing, and the Chinese like that. And so they don't object to us throwing our weight around in the Middle East. They kind of like it, because we're not bothering them. And so things get very good then between us, our two countries. But China at this point, their economy is growing to such an extent the rest of the world is noticing and starting to be fearful that everything's getting made in China. Everything you buy at Walmart in the 2000s seems to come from China. A lot of American factory jobs, which in the 90s had gone to Mexico, those jobs will go from America to China and also from Mexico to China. And so China is, we start to notice these things, and the changes are seen as not all good. And the Chinese notice this too. So there's a Chinese academic, a professor who is connected with the government, who tours America in 2002. And he's all hearing about Americans are afraid of China. This worries him. He goes back and he tells Hu Jintao this, that we're starting to scare the rest of the world. This could be a problem. So he convinces Hu, he comes up with this phrase for Hu called the peaceful rise, that China means no one any harm. We want to be friendly to our neighbors, friendly to the Americans, we don't want war, and so benefits for everyone, positive sum. Everyone's going to benefit, and that becomes the new slogan, this idea, and that kind of continues up this hide our strength and bide our time. It's a continuation of that policy and that message, and that will continue over this period of time. And as you see here, the increase, this is Jiang Zemin's period. The Chinese economy is growing healthily, but it's still relatively small. It's in the 2000s, under Hu Jintao, that the Chinese economy really takes off and people start to notice. And it starts to affect the world, that they have so much money, they're buying lots of American treasury bonds, they're investing overseas, they're starting to throw their economic weight around. In 2005, China's economy surpasses Germany's to become the world's third largest. By 2010, China's economy surpasses Japan to become the second largest in the world. And now, in the 2020s, their economy is close to the size of America's economy. So now they're an economic superpower. They're big time in ways they weren't under Deng Xiaoping. And so that is the importance of this idea of the peaceful rise, to keep everyone still at ease. And again, America is doing other things in the 2000s, has other foreign priorities, so we're not making that an issue. Plus, free trade is still popular, at least among the elites of both political parties and so forth, that this is seen as a good thing. That, yes, it costs American jobs, but it leads to lower prices, and other jobs can be created, and this is seen as kind of how to create the future economy, that this is all part of it. And so by and large, this is still seen as more positive than negative. Also, by this period, it becomes clear in the 90s that American businesses want into China. That in the 70s and 80s, American businesses didn't really care about China, and presidents did what they wanted. By Clinton's time, he comes into office actually wanting to be tough on China, kind of like George W. Bush did. And he, because it's right after Tiananmen, and he thinks George H.W. Bush was too nice to the Chinese after that, and he wants to press them on human rights. Basically say, you want to trade with us, treat your people well, treat your people better. And he tries that for like a year, and then American corporations come to him and say, stop it. We want in. They're keeping us out and letting the Germans and the Japanese in. This is not working. And so then he has to change his approach. And he does so. And that sets the standards for what happens later on in terms of new groups having influence in America, affecting things. You saw a preview of that with Deng in Texas, but still it was on a very small scale. So China, by this period, they're becoming a major economy. Also in 2008, you have the financial crisis, and it looks like the whole edifice that America has created might come crashing down. So China, late in Hu Jintao's rule, kind of jumps the gun. They start becoming arrogant. They start assuming by 2009 that we're going to collapse, Europe's going to collapse, China's going to rise sooner than expected. That doesn't happen, so they quickly tone it down, but they start to sense that we are weakening, and therefore, their time can come sooner than expected. And, he has his 10 years, and then in 2012, Xi Jinping takes over. And now, so China by now, undisputed second largest economy, world's largest manufacturer, and its Army and especially its Navy have grown, so it is in a different position now. Plus it has tons of money to throw around and invest in the rest of the world. And so he's going to have a different approach than his predecessors. He's going to try to be less deferential, less respectful. So he creates this phrase, striving for achievement. And you notice like with Zhang and Hu and Xi, they all kind of look the same. They all have the same like monochromatic tie, black suit, white shirt, always black hair, always slicked back, and there's a reason for that. This is how all of China's leaders look. Like all, the hundreds of the leading Chinese elites, they all have this uniform. And especially the dyed hair. Like you don't have gray hair if you're a Chinese politician, even if you're 70 years old. So it is their uniform. It is how they look. And if you see, them all in a line, they will all look exactly the same, and so forth. That is kind of how they show their power and their status. And so he takes over. He is in a different position than Zhang or Hu. First of all, he is what is in China is known as a princeling. His father was a leading general under Mao. So he is, if you're a princeling, it means your parents were leading Communist Party officials. You're part of the in crowd. And so forth, and that gives you advantages. Either politically, if you want to go into politics, or economically, you can engage in lots of corruption and use contacts to make money. So, there's lots of rich, spoiled princelings in China today, and he's one of them. But he goes into politics, and he uses his connections to become very powerful. Since his dad was a leading general, he has military connections Hu and Zhang lacked. So he has all the power bases on his side immediately. And so his potential for becoming a more autocratic leader is greater than his predecessors. He has the ability, from the beginning to kind of buck the system of collective rule, of, consensus governing and things like that. And he makes clear he's going to do that. And also, this is reflected foreign-wise in that he has this idea of striving for achievement. We're done sitting on the sidelines. Now China will do things. It will invest in Africa. It will set up its own institutions to loan money to poorer countries. It will have its own role in the world. It won't just be America's junior partner. It's going to try to be an actor in its own right. So he makes that clear. But he still, at least early on, is trying to be relatively nice to the U.S. The basis of the relationship has not changed. We're still going to pretend to work together. We're going to be competitors, but we're going to be friendly. And that is, and so he's there during President Obama's second term. And so this is him with Obama. This is them hanging out. They're still doing the friendly thing. There's, grumbling in both countries that, each wants to be more antagonistic to the other. But this is kind of how, they're still kind of going on the way things were before. It's very clear by now that China will not be democratic, that they're not heading in that direction. So that dream is gone. Also, it's clear that, all the money they've now that they, openness to economics is not going to lead to political openness. It hasn't, and it won't in the future. In fact, things are getting more closed in China, that they're limiting access to the internet, creating their own kind of parallel internet structure, their own version of Google, their own version of Amazon, their own version of social networks to basically, so they can control it and, make sure that people only see what they want them to see. And Xi continues that trend to a great degree. And he tries to centralize power, and he's the first leader since Mao to try to create his own cult of personality, to try to, have leader worship. He adopts titles that only Mao had, like Great Helmsman, which Mao had and other successors did not have. That he's the one in charge. He is the one driving things and creating slogans and ideas. And Mao had Mao Zedong's thought, his theories on politics. Xi has Xi Jinping thought, which is, there's not much there, just as in terms of personality, there's not much there. But he wants people to kind of worship him the way Deng did not want Chinese leaders to be worshipped, because he had saw under Mao what that could lead to. And so Xi wants, people to think very highly of him, and kind of, view him in awe. And so he is going to brook no criticism. And of course, this is the era of the internet. So this is a period where, leaders can be cut down to size. So, and that was done very quickly with Xi, which he cracked down on, most famously with the Winnie the Pooh memes. So this picture, so people in China quickly did this, and our leader looks a lot like Winnie the Pooh, and that is very insulting to Xi. So what he does quickly is, Winnie the Pooh is banned in China now, and putting a picture online of Winnie the Pooh is seen as an act of government dissent that can throw you in prison. So I will brook no dissent, I will brook no criticism. You will not trifle with me, you will certainly not belittle me. That's not going to happen. And this is the meme would continue. So this is him with the Japanese Prime Minister. And so they did a whole thing of this, and China quickly cracked down because that's not how they want their leader to be seen. Xi wants to be worshipped. He wants to be seen as a big man, as someone who is completely in charge, and someone the Chinese will follow, as they followed no one since Mao. Not even Deng Xiaoping was powerful enough; he could have done this, but he chose not to because he viewed it as dangerous. He wanted to go a different way. Xi's going a different way, and so. This is official Chinese propaganda. This is how Xi wants to be seen. So this is from 2014. It is a Chinese poster called The Chinese Dream. So Xi borrows this idea from a Chinese colonel who writes a book in 2010 called The China Dream. And it's also known there as the strong nation dream. So, America has the American dream, which is about individuals succeeding, anyone can make it, and so forth. The China dream, very different, notably. It is about the nation being strong and respected overseas, and, China being number one, not taking everyone over, but everyone kind of looking up to China. That is the idea of the China dream. And this colonel writes a book about it. It becomes a bestseller. Xi adopts that idea, just as Hu had adopted that intellectual's idea of the peaceful rise. Same sort of borrowing. And so this is China Dream, and you see what he has here. Aircraft carrier, which China is building a couple of. It's much smaller than American aircraft carriers, has about half as many planes, much less sophisticated, and they have only a couple of them, but new sign of Chinese strength. The Army, the Navy, this is, the idea is, rockets, satellites, jets, this is China. We are flexing our muscles. So that is something China had hid before. They are no longer hiding their strength. And the question is, how long will they bide their time? So this is called The Chinese Dream from 2014. This is another one called The Chinese Dream from 2016. And so that's him with his wife. And this shows China's economic might, all its big skyscrapers, all its, all its wealth. So this is, China, past and present and future, what China's doing. And that is his wife, the First Lady of China. Xi is not a glamorous man. He wishes he were, but he doesn't have glamour or charisma or any of that. His wife, on the other hand, was a fairly famous Chinese pop singer in the 1980s and 1990s who appeared on television a lot. So people would know her as a genuine celebrity. So she is the glamour one in the couple. And so forth, and that certainly he's showing that off in this poster here, and so forth, and that is this is the image he projects to the Chinese people, and so forth, in this sort of way. So in 2017, in 2016, you have Brexit. You have the British people voting to leave the European Union, which is seen as, new chaos in Europe. And you have the election in America of Donald Trump. And in response to that, Xi comes up with a new slogan, great changes unseen in a century. That, this is a time of chaos and China can take advantage of the chaos. Now, and so this is Xi with Trump in the Forbidden City near Tiananmen Square shortly after Trump takes office, and they actually get along. So personally, they get along. At first, the Chinese they're afraid of Trump. They're intimidated by him. They don't know what to make of him. He's an unknown commodity. They don't know how to work with him. He kind of unsettles them. Then they quickly realize that, he likes flattery. He likes when people are nice to him, and so they do that. And that works well, at least in the interpersonal part. That, whenever Xi meets with Trump, Trump tells everyone how great Xi is, how wonderful Xi was to him, how much they get along on a personal level. And so on a personal level, they actually get along quite well in their meetings and stuff, and have friendly times and stuff. Behind the scenes, of course, Trump is saying, we're suckers, China's playing us for suckers, this trade thing is one-sided, so he puts tariffs on Chinese products, they put tariffs on our products, they're both still there, that issue is unresolved. Biden has kept the tariffs for fear of looking weak on China and so forth, so we become more antagonistic to China and started seeing maybe all these things done under Reagan and Clinton and Bush, were not all positive for America. And so that, rhetorically he became tougher on China, and China's become tougher on us, and the relationship has turned more hostile. We still do plenty of trade with them and so forth, and that hasn't stopped. But the tone of it definitely begins to change with Trump, and that is in part a reflection of how Americans view the situation of public opinion. And that is important because all the slides I showed are leaders. They're heads of state meeting each other. And that was how the relationship was set up. That's how the Chinese liked it. Keep the people out of it. Just the men in charge, the leaders, they will do everything. And that's what Nixon wanted. That's exactly, that's how Nixon saw diplomacy. And so that was perfect. But over time, people intruded. Americans objected to Tiananmen Square. Americans objected to losing factory jobs to China. And then Trump reflects that. Trump is able to take advantage of and give voice to that. Similarly, in China, you have a lot of Chinese nationalists who read all their government propaganda and say, like, why don't we have Taiwan? Why are the Americans still having military bases all around us? This is, why aren't we flexing our muscles? And so in China, you have similar sorts of things that China is being too weak. And this goes back to the 90s in terms of the Chinese public, of people basically calling for China to be more, antagonistic to America, and that's grown over time. And the Chinese government has started to give voice to that. So that is important as well in terms of driving the changes in the relationship. That China is becoming more assertive, and America is reacting to that, and very belatedly, because Americans, don't make waves, keep your head down, all that. That had been the case for so long. Americans thought China would always do that. And they didn't see that it was a means to an end, which the Chinese were very clear about, that this was a temporary plan until they got strong enough to throw their weight around. But Americans thought, this was always going to be the case, and were shocked when they realized it wasn't. Perhaps, clearly they shouldn't have been, but they were. They were very clear about this. Like right after Tiananmen Square, when the rest of the world is condemning Deng Xiaoping, he says to one of his officials, like, basically, screw them. I don't care what they think. That China no longer needs to care what the rest of the world thinks. We are strong enough now, and our children and grandchildren will be strong enough that we can do whatever we want. And that's the same thing, Xi Jinping says. When we criticize him for what he does in Hong Kong or what he does to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, none of your business. We don't need to listen to you anymore. That's always been baked into the system, and it's just becoming more obvious to us now. So that is very important to understand. Why these things are changing. When they are changing. Another thing is Xi, was supposed, the 10 years were up last year, but he, very easily got, a new term, and basically now is China's leader for life, which was not supposed to happen. And this is at the party Congress, which they have every 5 years in the fall to announce their new leaders and things like that. And it used to be you get 2 5-year terms, then a new generation comes in. And Xi, by 2017, had changed that. So by 2022, this was going to be a coronation. And what you see here is Xi Jinping and the old leader Hu Jintao, who has gray hair, which indicates he's in retirement because he's no longer dyeing his hair anymore. He doesn't care. But there was a moment during the whole thing where Hu was kind of led away by force. And at first it was thought this was a power play by Xi, because sometimes dictators do that. But that was not the case, because that's not how the Chinese work. They do all their backstabbing in private, and then in public, they have a show of unity. That's how they like to do it. That these are choreographed affairs where everyone pretends to be getting along with everyone else. So it was quickly realized what most likely happened, we don't know for sure because no one said anything, is that Hu doesn't like what Xi's doing. He doesn't like it, so he kind of did this thing where he pretended to be kind of a confused old man who had to be led away, and this is his quiet way of showing that, like, I do not approve. I do not support what's going on here. Of course, he is powerless now, and Xi has made it this way, in part because when Deng opened up the economy and they started making money, the Chinese communist leadership got into it, and they all became enormously corrupt, giving favors and stuff and making money. And so, corruption became like the order of the day, even though it was technically illegal to steal money and take bribes. But it was seen as, just an inevitable byproduct of economic development. So the entire party's corrupt, and it's very unpopular. People don't like their corrupt leaders. And so Xi takes over, he launches an anti-corruption campaign. campaign, where he basically fires 600,000 communist officials and throws thousands of them in jail and publicizes all the money they stole, and this is why you're going to jail. And that makes him hugely popular with the people, that he's fighting corruption, he's getting rid of the bad guys. On the other hand, the other thing is he's only prosecuting the people he suspects are not loyal to him. So since everyone is corrupt, he can selectively, take out 600,000 and replace them with his cronies, and that, basically is what happens. That essentially, like, the elite leadership of China when he takes over includes people who he had, climbed over to become the leader who don't like him. And, now all those people are gone and replaced by his followers and something, so that was the whole point of the anti-corruption campaign, to basically show, like, if I don't like you, I can get you. And he's done that. So there are a lot of, Chinese leaders who don't like, that they're not going to get their chance at greater power, but they're not in a position to oppose him now. And so the other thing with Xi, and I'm sure you'll ask questions about Taiwan later on, is that, the idea of Taiwan is it's a part of China. We recognize it as a part of China. America says it should be peacefully reunited. The Chinese say it should be reunited. They take out the peacefully part, but they always kick the can down the road. They weren't prepared. They weren't able to. So it was something they were going to do in their future. Xi has kind of hinted he's going to stop doing that. That he essentially says, like, if we keep putting this off forever, it will never get done. I want this done in my lifetime. Xi will turn 70 this year. So we're talking like probably, next 15 years, he may want to move on that issue. And so that, again, is something to keep in mind, in that, that he wants to have that achievement of making China whole again. And I mentioned, the business part, and that's the case not only with China, with America, but with China's allies. So for instance, this is Olaf Scholz, the current president of Germany. Germany was very big on this whole idea of peace through trade, that you trade with your enemies, they're no longer your enemies. They did a lot of this with Russia. For 20 years, they got tons of cheap natural gas from Russia, which helped their economy and was great for their businesses. Then Russia invades Ukraine. And one of the reasons Putin did that is he assumed the Germans would, they'd always take the natural gas. They'd never, get mad at him because he had them financially locked in. Olaf changes that. The German industry, is starting to develop other alternative sources of energy, getting natural gas from other places, finding other ways to get electricity and stuff. And they have, They move slowly on Russia, but they have done changes there. China, they have not. So their businesses have made clear to him that, we're doubling down on China. China is Germany's second leading trading partner. Germany is one of China's leading trading partner. And so German businesses, like, we want in China, and don't you dare do to China what we've had to do to Russia. And so the Europeans, China is very far away. It's not a threat to them. It's a source of economic development. So they're, not going to be supportive of containing China, risking war with China. That would be very bad for them. And this is last November. So this is well after the Ukraine war and stuff. And he's making clear, like, I'm still your friend, Xi. I'm still on your side. Germany, China, we're still together. We're still friends and close partners. Even while America has cracked down on China, our businesses are still deeply involved in China and would not want us to go to war with China. That would be very catastrophic for pretty much every leading American corporation, both as a market and as a place where their goods are manufactured. It would cause untold, chaos in our economy. And a good example of this, is Elon Musk, who, most of his money is with Tesla, the car company. And Elon Musk is known for saying what he thinks on Twitter and criticizing people on Twitter and being afraid of no one. But it's noteworthy, he has never said a bad word about China or Xi Jinping. That is because China is their leading growth market for their cars and has one of their largest factories. So he knows that there are certain people he cannot offend, and those people are the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, everything he's tweeted about the Chinese Communist Party is positive, and most of it are retweets of straight-up Communist Party propaganda about how great China is. So, that kind of shows, where, America's economic elites still are on the matter. That, that we are still very tied to China, and they are also tied to us. So just as, if you ask me about the Ukraine war, I'll explain China's position on it, that while, basically, while there's certain things we won't do to offend China, there's certain things China won't do to offend us, because we can still both hurt each other. And that's important to keep in mind going forward in the question and answer period, that, They are our rivals economically, our adversaries militarily, but the Soviets had basically a closed economy. They did their thing in the communist world, we did our thing in the rest of the world, but us in China and our allies in China hopelessly intertwined, and that would make a war very different in scope. We can't untangle our economies very easily. And the stuff that have been tried under Trump and Biden is still on a very small scale instead of building stuff in our allies countries, building stuff in America. And so that is important to understand that we're still in a position, kind of like a Siamese twin thing where you cut us apart, you kill both. And that is important to keep in mind going forward, that the economic relationship that began under Deng with that cowboy hat outside Houston, it's so intertwined now, you can't really break the connections without causing enormous mutual harm. And with that in mind, I will take your questions now. So because I haven't talked much about Taiwan, I can talk about that, the war in Ukraine and China's position on that. So let's get going.
I don't understand competition. Why do countries compete?
Oh, because...
I don't get...
Okay, well, the idea is you want to maximize your wealth. Previously, countries would see it as a zero-sum game, that if I get wealthier, you have to get poorer. That's how the English saw it, when they had the Americans as colonies. They didn't like us trading with other people, and that helped cause the Revolutionary War. Later on, you get the idea of free trade, that everyone can benefit. Trump very much thinks in that old-fashioned way that, our gain is their loss, their gain is our loss. He thought this about Japan in the 80s. It's the one issue he's always been consistent on, that free trade is for suckers. We're the losers in that game, whether it's Japan or China or whoever. So the countries, they want to be stronger militarily, they want to be stronger economically. Often they benefit simultaneously, but differentially. The main issue is countries grow when they trade with each other, but some grow more than others, and then that differential growth leads to some countries surpassing others, and that leads to conflict. But generally, they want to compete to make their people wealthier, make their military stronger, things like that. But it's changed over time, and like with Clinton, the idea Clinton and Jiang Zemin is we can both benefit from this. So even while so that makes the competition a bit more awkward, that you're trying to be mutually beneficial, but each hopes to get more out of it than the other. That's kind of the way these sorts of things work. Yes, sir.
My sense is that China holds a good portion of our national debt. Is that true?
Yeah, it is less than it used to be. So like 2008, they were the leading buyers of American debt. And now they haven't sold it, but they buy less of it than they used to. They started to diversify, because the issue was basically that it led to kind of theoretically they could sell our debt and cause problems, but that would also hurt them. So, they realized they were becoming too dependent on buying. Basically, China, when they sell lots of stuff overseas, they don't let the money circulate in their economy. They want to either invest it or hoard it. So that's why they have trillions of dollars to spend, and they have to spend it somewhere, and they do it either buying foreign companies, foreign real estate, or, in the case of treasury bills, foreign debt. So that's less than before. They still have trillions, but we have now, $30 trillion in debt. So they're no longer as huge buyers of that as they used to be. They have diversified in that from what they were in the 2000s. But in the 2000s, they were basically financing our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which was paid for with $6 trillion in debt, and they were the ones loaning us that money. So that has changed to a certain degree. That's less of a leverage than it used to be. And it was never a really good leverage, because if they wanted to meddle with that, they would only hurt themselves. Yes, sir.
Let's go back to 1979.
Yes.
The Houston visit.
Yes.
Kissinger retired in 77 or 78.
77, yes.
Okay. And wasn't he the first one that he said, I'm going to start making money now? Someone asked him,
yeah,
what are you going to do? I'm going to start making money now. And he formed a group that was doing business with China to get them to come over here. Wasn't he behind?
He was one, yes, but there were many, and there were some before him. Like there was a professor, a conservative professor, who opposed reaching out to China in the 1970s, and then he retires in 1976. And of course, the big company back then in Seattle is Boeing. And China desperately wants their commercial jets, because they have all these crappy old Soviet jets. They want modern American jets. And so he goes to work for Boeing and uses his Chinese contacts and Chinese language and stuff to basically the next 20 years of his life to, basically sell out. So that was a common thing, both among people like Kissinger who supported this and people like that professor I mentioned who opposed it. So everyone was doing that. Kissinger did some of it, but everyone else, like even in Texas, like the Democratic lieutenant governor refused to meet with him, the Republican governor refused to meet with him, but the moment he left, they reached out to the Chinese government for their respective oil companies to sell products to China. In that case, the William Clements, the Republican governor, he failed to get the contract, but the Democratic lieutenant governor did in future tech. He did get, selling equipment to China. So, even those who publicly condemned Deng, right when he was in Texas, the moment he left, behind the scenes, they were trying to cash in as well. So that was universal. That was very much universal. Kissinger was part of it, but he was by no means the first, by no means the last, and he was kind of, in terms of selling that influence in that sort of way. But that was a very common thing in the United States. It began in the 70s, but got huger later, much bigger later on.
Was he involved with Coca-Cola?
No. That was Coca. That was basically Coke was in. The idea was Pepsi had the Soviet Union, and that was the only soft drink served in the Soviet Union, until it fell. And so Coke desperately wanted to China, and they actually had connections to China. So Coca-Cola, before the Chinese took over, their largest bottling plant in the world was in Shanghai. So the Chinese, had a taste for Coke in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and they used that to get back. So that was the reason why, that they already had these, pre-existing, they had been in China before, and they were going to be in China again.
Another question?
Yes.
What's your take on the baseball league taking the All-Star game out of the lab because Delta, Coca-Cola,
Oh, yes.
and who was the other one?
I forget. It was a couple years ago. Yes, objection to a law that had been passed. That was, there were symbolic things like that. Like a similar thing happened in North Carolina a couple years earlier with the All-Star game. Again, different issue, and those were kind of symbolic sorts of things. There's less of that now, I think, with those, than there was 5 years ago, in part because, sport and politics is a little, briefly became something where athletes became very big political activists. That's less so than it was maybe 2 years ago in terms of that. The relation to China there, and there is none, but in terms of sports and stuff, is that, the NBA is huge in China. They do a lot of business in China, and so NBA stars generally, they will refrain from that. Other athletes similarly will refrain from criticizing what the Chinese government does, and when they do, their teams lavishly apologize to the Chinese government and so forth. So that kind of that tangentially relates to that, and it shows the power the Chinese have. People will not raise issues of injustices there because they are afraid of hurting their bottom line. Yes, back there.
Do you have a prediction about the future of Taiwan?
Yes. Okay, very good question. The thing there, I do not. The thing with the war over Taiwan involving Taiwan and us and Japan and others on one side and China on the other is it would be extraordinarily destructive for all involved and for the world and have a very uncertain outcome because of the nature of the weapons. That China's Navy, they have more ships than us. Smaller ships, they have less firepower. They send their Navy out, we largely destroy it. But on the other hand, they have lots of missiles on land, conventional missiles, guided missiles. First of all, they will launch thousands of those at at Taiwan, and devastate Taiwan's cities and economy and kill lots of their people. They could also sink a couple of our aircraft carriers, which would be very shocking. The U.S. Navy, is not used to losing ships, has not done so in large quantities since World War II, so that would be very shocking. And then they could shoot down our pilots when we went to attack their bases, and so you would have massive American casualties, massive American loss of both life and equipment, and it would kind of be this standoff war in that way where we could both do enormous damage to each other, but it would be very hard for either side to really prevail. So that is, the question is, what would provoke China to take that risk? And it's an enormous risk. If they lose the war, they lose enormous legitimacy. And even if they win the war, there's a lot of devastation. So the question of, is it worth it for them in the short term? That's a big issue. The other thing to keep in mind, and this gets back to the economic connections, that the majority of the world's high-end chips, the ones that power your phones, your computers, your cars, your appliances, your TVs, are made in a handful of factories in Taiwan. They, for whatever reason, over time, like they invested more than the Americans or the Japanese or the South Koreans in this technology, and they have them. So if war starts, we lose access to those chips, which is devastating to American tech companies and like knocks us back 30 years technologically. And that would have untold effects on the global economy. There's also the fact that since this is a vital strategic resource, no way the Americans are going to let the Chinese communists get this. And so we won't say it, but basically, if the Chinese are in a position to take Taiwan, America will shoot a bunch of missiles into Taiwan and destroy those factories and all their high-tech equipment and stuff so that no one will get them. And that will be a major effect on the global economy as well. So it will hurt everyone involved and everyone not involved. The other thing there is that in terms of a war there is that the Chinese may take a different approach, given all the scenarios I laid out, which is to kind of blockade Taiwan. Taiwan has all their, they run on natural gas for their power, and they have a weak supply in reserves. So you cut off their natural gas, you cut off their foods, you cut off the raw materials they use to make their microchips, their economy shuts down. And China could do that with their Navy and their missiles and their Air Force. And so they may do that and kind of dare us to go in and break the blockade and make it look like we're starting the war. And so that is one strategy they may take, as opposed to a straight up cross 100 miles across the water, land troops on the beaches, invade, which would be the most risky approach and most costly. So there's different ways they could go about it in that way. So I don't know what would happen in a war. I know it would be extraordinarily destructive, and it's certainly the sort of thing that a lot of people, especially business interests in all countries, do not want, because it would be completely catastrophic. In terms of Germany having to deal with Russia not giving them their natural gas anymore, this is a whole order of magnitude of economic interlockage than that, and so that's important to keep in mind in that way. So no idea how it would go, but it would be very it would be extraordinarily destructive for all involved in ways we haven't experienced in wars in a long time. Yes, sir.
I know that in Austin they're making a lot more. They're making a big shift back.
Yes.
And I'm sure it's not going to work by how long will it take before we don't have to be dependent on Taiwan?
At best 20 years, and those factories, by the way, are built by the Taiwanese company that does all the microchips. So they are setting up factories in Arizona and Texas to build lower-end chips and hopefully higher-end chips 20 years down the line. But it's very precision technology. It takes a long time to develop, and it's not a given. So Japan, in the past 10 years, has tried to restart their chip industry, to do their own thing, and it's been a failure. Their companies have invested billions, and they haven't been able to do that. It's very uncertain technology, very precision technology, involves a lot of wastage before you get it right, and that's in part why American tech companies stopped building chips here, 30 years ago, because it wasn't worth the uncertain investments, and also why the Japanese and the South Koreans did the same thing. So even if they build them, they're probably going to be low-end chips and not all of, and so best case scenario, a generation. So that would take a very long time in that regard to kind of recreate what already exists in other places. Yes?
Does the reported decrease in their population affect China in the near future?
Yes. So they knew this day was coming. It's coming sooner than expected. Basically, China had a one-child policy because they were in danger of severe overpopulation. Eventually, they realized this was backfiring, and they went from stopping their people from having children to begging their people to have children. But by then, their people didn't want to have children. And so their birth rate is low, and they wish it were higher. But things are expensive. Children are expensive. Property is expensive, and and it's just not. They're at the stage of development where they would have low birth rates anyway, and so that will be a problem in terms of their economic growth, their labor force. 20, 30 years down the line, taking care of all the old people. Given they're a lot poorer than us per person, that will be very hard. The other big thing there is with the Chinese is that may up the time where they go for Taiwan, because they may think there's a window of us, achieving maximum power, and that window may be closing faster than they expected, and so that may cause them to jump the gun on Taiwan in that way, before they become kind of a geriatric nation like Japan and South Korea are becoming. So that is also important to keep in mind in that way, that it may encourage the Chinese to be more reckless. Because the one thing, more dangerous than a rising power is a rising power that doesn't think time is on its side. That's what Germany was in 1914. They're like, yeah, we're better than everyone else now, but Russia's catching up with us. In 10 years from now, we're not going to be able to win this war. So, so that is the most dangerous thing, that a rising power that thinks that it is running out of time and it has to strike, while it's at the peak of its strength. And other things. A couple of questions here.
What about COVID?
Oh, COVID, yes. Okay, so China did very stringent lockdowns very early on, and they didn't get much COVID in 2020 and 2021, but they also didn't get our mRNA vaccines. They were, they did like, we're Chinese, we can do this on our own. We're going to walk on two legs and do things ourselves. And they made vaccines that were a lot less reliable, and so didn't give people immunity and left them exposed. And eventually, they had to open up their economy again. It was costing too much, and so now they're having a massive COVID outbreak, delayed, but all at once and stuff. Now that they've had to open up their economy again, and their people were getting sick and tired of staying home and not making money, and that. And like they were lockdowns, like you could not leave your house, for like a month or something if there was COVID in your area, and they delivered food to your door, and if you went outside, you were arrested, and you had daily tests. It was a whole, so it was, what we had here in the U.S. was, nothing compared to what they would have there and what they enforced there. But now they're in a position where they are kind of, they're having to face it in a non-advantageous sort of way. And ways that also hurt their reputation among their people. So the Chinese government, as the economy grew, they had an aura of competence. Though, they knew what they were doing. They were experts and things like that. And now, there's some questioning about that, some grumbling. Not enough to cause revolts and things like that, but some grumbling in that way about the competence of their leaders and things like that, that maybe they're not, all-knowing and all-seeing and things like that. The other thing with that, another reason why China, as they got richer, the rich people did not challenge the government, is because the communists made clear, like, we made you, we could unmake you. So rich people who were seen as kind of flexing their muscles and being too independent and saying the wrong things, they would have to divest their companies, they'd be put in prison for a while. They would make an example of them. And also, before that, they did positive stuff. Like in the 1990s, they allowed capitalists and businessmen to join the Communist Party, which you do for the connections and stuff. And so they can do things for you, but they can also do things against you. So that was a big reason why, when they opened their economy, they did not have to open their politics, because they basically absorbed the capitalists. Also, a lot of the Communist Party officials used their connections to become capitalists and become super wealthy themselves. Like Jiang Zemin, some of his children are billionaires. They're extraordinarily wealthy. Hu Jintao, his friends got extraordinarily wealthy. Same with Xi Jinping's friends. So, that kind of merged in a way. But it's clear the politicians have the power in that way. No matter how rich you are in China, you are not above the government, and things like that, unless you flee and those sorts of things, which some have done. So that is also important to understand, and that helps explain why, as China has built skyscrapers and become a completely different country, the same group of men have been able to rule it and not been challenged at all. That, in a way, they learned from the failed Soviet reforms. They learned what not to do, and they did it in a different sort of way, which worked for them. Yes, sir?
The total population of China isn't only about 10% communist?
The party, but that's a fairly high amount. Usually communist parties are only a couple percentage points, because you have to apply to be a part of the Communist Party. You go through background checks and things. So so about 1.4 billion, but over 100 million people are members of the party, which is a lot for a communist party. And the Soviet Union was never that high a percentage, because again, that gives you privileges. You're a member of the club, so you don't want everyone to be a member of the club. It's something you decide as a young person to do, and you make the right connections, and you join for the various benefits and privileges and things like that.
Do you see down the road where that could be a failure?
No, because there's, in terms of the people in China who are disgruntled, it's very few, because they can look back and say, I live better than my parents, I live way better than my grandparents. And so for peasants and stuff, people from the countryside, they're way better. Poor people in cities, way better. The wealthy people, the middle class, they owe they feel they owe the government, so they are very loyal. Really, the only groups in China in the last 20 years who have been disgruntled are the people who worked for the state companies, who worked for the old kind of state iron and steel factories, which are declining. China has its own Rust Belt, just as we do in America and other countries do. And they over time have been let go. And they used to be the privileged ones when China was poor. That they were the only ones with pensions, the only ones whose kids got free education, the only ones who had guaranteed employment and good standards of living. So as the rest of China has changed, they've been left behind, but they tend to be older and not be that politically powerful. They grumble when they lose their privileges and and stuff, but there's not much they can do.
So what percent is
Just
poor?
one more question.
Oh, okay, yes. What percent is, I'm not sure, their standards are different than ours, so there's still plenty of poor people in the countryside, but, when Deng Xiaoping was in America, basically everyone was poor. So the change has been dramatic in the way, and generally the poor people have, options to get wealthier, so they are not complaining either in that way. So there's not really a powerful group in China that is dissenting that could be a basis for kind of any sort of challenging the government. They've been very good about co-opting those groups. Last question? Yes, absolutely.
Would you say that China is the #1 country that is involved in trying to get our intellectual property?
They have been, yes. They often, when companies went in there, they would do technology transfers. You want to come into China, you got to give us your trade secrets and your stuff, and we will steal that from you. So that was one of the conditions for getting into China. So they've done a lot of that. That is what all rising powers do. That is what America does. Alexander Hamilton set up a whole bureau at the Treasury Department dedicated to stealing British patents and convincing British inventors to come to America, which was a capital offense in England at the time. If they caught you, they would kill you. So like the moment America was founded, it's like Britain's the leading economic power. We have to steal from them. Our government will bribe people. So we, that is something, that we were certainly guilty of in the past. So that they have certainly done that as a large economy and stuff over time. But that is what countries in their position do, and they're able to leverage their market to be able to do that. And they have been successful in trying to do that. In terms of reproducing it in China, it's hit or miss in that way, that just because you steal the blueprints doesn't mean you can build it, especially when you get to super high-tech stuff. So for instance, they're also trying to develop their own microchips and spending billions on it. But they haven't had any success either, in terms of, competing with Taiwan and stuff. So they've been trying to do the same thing, that's being done at that factory in Austin. And that's important to keep in mind, that they've kind of reached the limits of what they can get from industrial espionage. That works when you have very little technology and you're on your way up, but they're kind of at the plateaued level where that doesn't it doesn't yield as many returns, and you start having to do your own innovations. They've done some artificial intelligence they've been very good at, in part because the government recognizes that facial recognition technology is great for spying on your own people and monitoring them. So they have very good incentive to be great at that, but other things less so. So they're at the point where they realize they have to do their own local innovations if they want to get to the next level. That is important. That's kind of in a way what Xi Jinping promised. Hasn't worked out yet as well as he hoped in terms of kind of that sort of additional progress for China. But that is where they find themselves now. That they can no longer they're past the imitation stage. Now they are at the stage where they need to innovate in their own right, and they've been trying to do that. But there's again. They're hitting limits as everyone else does. So thank you for staying here, and I enjoyed my talk with you, and I hope you enjoyed it too.